"We are moving in." Ashley said it before I even set my suitcase down, like it was already decided, like my presence in my own home was just a formality she had to acknowledge on her way inside. I stood there for a moment, the alpine air still clinging to my coat, the crisp scent of pine and snow grounding me in a way her words could not. The villa sat quietly behind me, exactly as I had left it weeks ago, stone walls warmed by late afternoon light, tall windows reflecting the mountains that had convinced me to buy this place in the first place. It was supposed to be my beginning, my quiet, my reward after a lifetime of noise and compromise. And yet, here she was, stepping past me like she owned the threshold, her heels clicking confidently across imported Italian tile I had chosen myself. I smiled, not because I agreed, not because I welcomed her, but because I understood something she clearly did not. Daniel followed behind her, slower, quieter, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets as if he had suddenly forgotten what to do with them. He didn't look at me, not once. That told me everything I needed to know. Ashley's voice carried through the open living room as she moved further inside, already commenting on the space like a real estate agent preparing a listing. "It's bigger than I expected," she said, running her fingers along the back of a leather chair I had shipped in from Denver. "A little outdated, but we can fix that." I closed the door behind me, the soft click echoing just enough to remind me that this house, this place, still answered to me. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the tall glass panels. Inside, Ashley's footsteps continued, confident, careless, claiming. She hadn't asked. She hadn't hesitated. She had simply decided. I watched her as she moved through the room, already choosing what would stay and what would go, her eyes scanning everything I had built as if it were temporary. As if I were temporary. "We brought enough to stay for a while," she added over her shoulder, almost casually, as though this were a vacation I had agreed to host. 6 suitcases. I had counted them before stepping inside. Not a visit. Not even close. Daniel finally spoke, his voice lower than usual, almost rehearsed. "It just makes sense, Mom. There's more space here." I nodded slowly, still smiling, still calm, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable. Because space wasn't the issue. It never was. Ashley turned then, her expression bright, expectant, waiting for resistance, maybe even hoping for it. But I gave her nothing. No argument. No raised voice. Just a quiet, measured breath and a simple glance around the room I knew better than anyone else. "Of course you are," I said gently, as if I were agreeing to something harmless. As if I hadn't already prepared for this exact moment long before they ever packed a single bag. The villa had been silent the last time I stood here alone, the kind of silence that felt earned after years of putting everyone else first. And I remember thinking how strange it was to finally hear my own footsteps without interruption, to move through rooms that did not ask anything from me except to exist. And that morning the sun had spilled across the kitchen counters in long, golden lines while I made coffee for one, measuring carefully out of habit even though there was no one left to share it with. And I had told myself that this was what peace looked like, that this was what I had worked for after 40 years of marriage, after raising a son, after learning how to live again when my husband was no longer there to fill the empty spaces. And I had chosen this place for a reason, not because it was extravagant, but because it was distant enough to feel like a boundary, a quiet line drawn between my past life and whatever came next. And when I signed the final papers 3 months ago, I had done so without telling Daniel right away, not out of secrecy, but out of instinct, because something in me had already begun to notice the subtle shifts, the shorter phone calls, the way his voice carried a kind of hesitation whenever Ashley was nearby, as if every word had to pass through her before it reached me. And I told myself it was normal, that marriages change people, that sons grow into their own lives. But there were moments that stayed with me, longer than they should have, like the time he asked casually about my savings as if it were a topic of small talk, or the way Ashley once laughed when I mentioned wanting to travel, calling it ambitious in a tone that did not feel like a compliment. And even then I did not argue. I simply listened, the way I always had, storing away details the way some people collect photographs, quietly, carefully, knowing they might matter later. And when I finally invited them to visit the villa, I kept it simple, just a weekend, just enough time to show them the place and share a meal, nothing more. But when Daniel replied, his message had been unusually quick, almost eager, and there had been a second message right after it, not from him, but from Ashley, already asking about room layouts, about storage space, about whether the master bedroom faced the mountains or the road, questions that felt too specific for a visit, too permanent for something temporary. And I remember standing in this same living room, reading those messages twice, then a third time, feeling something settle quietly in my chest, not fear, not anger, just recognition, the kind that does not need to announce itself because it has been building slowly all along. And that was the moment I stopped thinking of this house as just a place to rest and started thinking of it as something I might have to defend, not loudly, not openly, but in the only way that has ever worked for me, with patience, with preparation, and with the understanding that some people only reveal who they truly are when they believe there are no consequences waiting for them on the other side of their decisions. The sound of zippers echoed faintly through the hallway as Ashley began unpacking without hesitation, her movements efficient and deliberate, as if she had done this before, as if arriving somewhere uninvited and turning it into her own space was simply part of her routine. And I stood near the staircase watching her place her things on the console table I had chosen from a small shop in Aspen, a piece I had driven nearly 200 miles to pick up myself because I liked the way the wood felt under my hands, and now it held her designer bags as if they had always belonged there. And Daniel lingered near the entrance, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes briefly meeting mine before drifting away again. And that same quiet distance settled between us, thicker now, harder to ignore, and I wondered when exactly that distance had begun, whether it was gradual or if there had been a moment I missed. A single decision that shifted everything without announcement, and Ashley's voice cut through my thoughts. Again, light and confident, already making plans out loud, talking about rearranging the furniture, opening up the space, maybe even replacing the dining table with something more modern, something that matched her taste rather than mine. And she said it casually, as if I were not standing 10 feet away, as if my opinion had already been considered and dismissed, and I walked slowly toward the kitchen, running my fingers along the edge of the marble countertop, grounding myself in the familiar weight of something I still controlled, something she had not yet touched. And from there I could hear her footsteps moving upstairs, quick and purposeful, heading straight toward the master bedroom without asking, without pausing. And I did not follow her, not immediately, because I already knew what she would find: the large windows facing the mountains, the private balcony, the quiet space that had once felt like mine alone. And a few seconds later her voice floated down, sharper now, carrying a note of satisfaction she did not bother to hide. And Daniel responded in a lower tone, something uncertain, something that sounded like agreement but felt more like surrender. And I stayed where I was, listening, not to their words but to what sat underneath them, the assumption, the certainty, the belief that I would accept this the same way I had accepted everything else. And I poured myself a glass of water, taking a slow sip, letting the silence settle again around me, because silence has always been my strongest advantage. It allows people to reveal themselves fully, to speak freely, to act without caution. And as I set the glass down, I glanced briefly toward the hallway where one door remained closed, unchanged, untouched, exactly as I had left it. And for the first time since they arrived, I felt something steady and certain take hold. Not anger, not even disappointment, just clarity. The kind that comes when you finally stop hoping someone will act differently and start preparing for who they have already shown you they are. By the time the sun dipped behind the mountains, the villa no longer sounded like mine. It echoed differently, filled with movement that did not belong to me. Drawers opening and closing upstairs, footsteps pacing across floors I had once walked slowly, intentionally, and I moved through the living room quietly, adjusting nothing, correcting nothing, letting everything settle exactly the way they arranged it, because sometimes the clearest way to see a situation is to leave it untouched. And Ashley came down the stairs not long after, her expression bright with a kind of ownership she had not earned, already speaking as if decisions had been finalized, mentioning how the guest room would be better suited as an office for Daniel, how the art on the walls felt dated, how the kitchen could use an upgrade, and each word landed lightly but carried weight underneath it, the kind that assumes agreement without asking for it. And I listened the way I always have, without interruption, without visible reaction, because reacting too early has never served me. And Daniel hovered nearby, nodding occasionally, his voice quieter, offering small confirmations that sounded less like choices and more like obligations. And I wondered if he realized how much of himself he had given away piece by piece, or if it had happened so gradually that he no longer noticed the difference. And Ashley turned toward me then, finally acknowledging my presence with a smile that felt practiced, asking if I minded if they stayed longer than planned, though the question came too late to mean anything, because their suitcases were already unpacked, their belongings already spread throughout the house like roots settling into soil, and I met her gaze calmly, holding it just long enough to make her pause, not out of fear, but out of curiosity, as if she could not quite read what sat behind my silence. And that uncertainty was something she was not used to. I could see it in the slight shift of her posture, the way her confidence flickered for just a second before returning stronger, louder, more certain, and I simply nodded once, slow and measured, giving her exactly what she expected on the surface while keeping everything else beneath it, and I turned away, walking toward the hallway without another word, my footsteps steady, unhurried, because there was no need to rush anything now. Not when everything was already unfolding exactly the way it needed to. And as I passed the closed door again, the one she had not yet opened, I let my hand rest briefly on the handle, just for a moment, not enough to draw attention, but enough to remind myself that some things were still exactly where I had left them, untouched, waiting, and for the first time since they arrived, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not of victory, not yet, but of certainty. The kind that comes when you understand that the story others think they are writing has already been finished by someone else long before they ever stepped inside. That night, the house settled into a rhythm that did not include me, their voices carrying faintly through the walls as they spoke upstairs, comfortable, unguarded, as if the space had already accepted them as its rightful owners. And I sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of tea I had not touched, letting the quiet stretch around me, not empty but observant. Because there is a difference between being alone and being excluded. And I had learned that difference slowly over the years, in moments that seemed small at the time, but had built into something undeniable, like the first time Ashley corrected Daniel in front of me, and he laughed it off instead of pushing back, or the way family dinners had shifted from conversations to performances where I was expected to listen more than speak. And I remembered how easily I had dismissed those moments, telling myself it was adjustment, that every new marriage comes with changes, that I should give them space to build their own life. But space has a way of turning into distance if you are not careful, and distance eventually becomes permission, permission to overlook, to dismiss, to assume. And now I could hear it clearly in the way Ashley spoke upstairs, her voice confident, outlining plans not just for the villa, but for what came next, mentioning possibilities like renting the place during certain seasons, calculating out loud what it could bring in, speaking about the property not as a home, but as an asset, something to be optimized, something to be used. And Daniel responded in short phrases, agreeing where it was easiest, quiet where it was not. And I wondered if he even realized that he was no longer part of the decision-making, only the confirmation. And I took a slow sip of tea, finally, letting the warmth settle before setting the cup down with deliberate care, because nothing they were saying surprised me anymore, not after the small questions, the subtle shifts, the careful way Ashley had always positioned herself just slightly ahead of every conversation, guiding it without appearing to. And I stood up then, moving through the kitchen with steady steps, turning off the light as I passed, leaving the room exactly as I had found it, because there was no need to reclaim anything yet. Not when everything they believed they had already taken was still resting exactly where I had chosen to place it. And as I reached the base of the stairs, I paused, listening one more time to the certainty in their voices, the quiet confidence that comes from believing you have already won. And I turned away without going up, choosing instead to walk back toward the hallway, toward the one space they had not yet questioned, not yet touched. And as I passed that closed door again, I did not stop this time. I simply let my hand brush lightly against the wall beside it, a small, absent gesture to anyone watching. But to me, it was something else entirely, a reminder that patience is not the same as surrender, and that sometimes the strongest position you can hold is the one no one else even realizes exists until it is far too late. Morning came quietly, the kind of slow, deliberate light that filled the villa from the mountains and stretched across the floors in long, pale lines. And for a brief moment, before the sounds of movement returned, it felt almost like it used to, calm, untouched, mine, and I stood by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the frost melt off the railing outside, letting the stillness settle into me before the day began again, because I knew it would not stay quiet for long. And right on cue, footsteps echoed from upstairs, followed by Ashley's voice, already sharp with purpose, already moving forward as if there was something to organize, something to improve, something to take control of, and I did not turn around immediately. I let her come to me, let her enter the room on her terms, because people reveal more when they believe they are leading, and she walked into the kitchen holding her phone, her expression focused, already speaking about schedules, about listings, about people she knew who could help evaluate the property, and she mentioned numbers casually, projected income, seasonal rates, renovation costs, all spoken as if the decisions had already been approved, as if the outcome was inevitable, and I listened without interrupting, leaning slightly against the counter, my hands steady around the cup, because there is power in letting someone speak uninterrupted, in giving them enough space to expose not just their plans but their assumptions. And Daniel entered a few seconds later, quieter as always, his eyes briefly meeting mine before drifting toward the floor, and Ashley turned to him mid-sentence, asking about timelines, about how quickly things could be set in motion, and he nodded, hesitated, then agreed in that same careful tone that had become so familiar, and I could see it clearly now, the pattern, the structure of it, not something sudden but something built over time, layer by layer, until it felt natural to them, until it no longer felt like taking, just adjusting, just improving, just doing what made sense, and I set my cup down. Gently, the soft sound drawing just enough attention to shift the moment. And for the first time that morning, Ashley paused, looking at me not with apology, but with expectation, waiting for approval she assumed would come, and I gave her a small, calm nod, nothing more, because agreement is not always what it appears to be, and I turned slightly, my gaze drifting once again toward the hallway, toward the closed door that remained exactly as it had been, untouched by her plans, untouched by her certainty, and for a brief second, her eyes followed mine, curiosity flickering across her face before she looked away again, dismissing it, overlooking it, just as she had overlooked everything else. That did not immediately serve her purpose, and I allowed that. I let her return to her plans, her numbers, her quiet confidence, because some doors are meant to stay closed just long enough for the right moment to arrive. And as the morning light shifted across the floor, I knew that moment was getting closer with every word she spoke. By midday, the villa no longer felt like a place waiting to be understood. It felt like a place being rewritten in real time. Ashley moving through each room with growing confidence. Her voice no longer exploratory but decisive, as if every hour that passed made her more certain that nothing would challenge her presence here. And I watched her from a distance, not following, not interrupting, simply allowing the pattern to unfold. Because patterns tell you far more than isolated moments ever can. And she had begun to repeat herself without realizing it, circling back to the same ideas, the same plans, the same assumptions about ownership and control, speaking openly now about long-term changes, about contracts, about bringing in professionals to evaluate the structure, the land, the potential, and Daniel remained close but slightly behind her, his agreement quieter, slower, almost automatic. And I noticed how rarely he spoke first, how often he waited for her to frame the thought before adding his own voice to it. And it struck me then that this was no longer about a single decision. It was a habit, something practiced, something reinforced over time until it no longer felt like influence, but like direction. And I moved toward the living room window, resting my hand lightly against the cool glass, watching the distant tree line shift under a passing wind, steady, unchanged, unaffected by anything happening inside these walls. And for a moment, I let myself remember what it felt like to stand here alone, before expectations, before assumptions, before anyone else believed they had a claim to what I had built. And behind me, Ashley laughed softly at something on her phone, a quick, satisfied sound that carried just enough to draw my attention without asking for it. And she mentioned reaching out to someone later in the week, someone Who could start the process? Her words casual but precise. And that was when I understood fully, not just what she wanted, but how far she believed she had already come, how certain she was that there would be no resistance, no interruption, no moment where the direction shifted away from her control, and I turned slowly, meeting her eyes just as she glanced up, her expression open, expectant, almost triumphant. And I gave her the same calm look I had given from the beginning, the same measured stillness that had offered her no friction, no warning, nothing she could define as opposition, and she smiled, satisfied with what she thought was agreement, and turned away again, already moving on to the next step in a plan she believed was hers to execute. And I let her continue, because there is a certain kind of certainty that only exists when it has never been tested, and the longer it goes unchallenged, the more complete it feels, and I knew that what she was building now, piece by piece, word by word, would make what came next not just unexpected, but undeniable. And as I walked past the hallway once more, my steps unhurried, my posture unchanged, I allowed myself a brief glance at the closed door, still silent, still waiting, and for the first time, I knew with absolute clarity that it would not remain closed much longer. By late afternoon, the villa carried a different kind of energy, not rushed, not chaotic, but settled in a way that suggested decisions had already been made without ever being spoken directly to me. And Ashley stood near the center of the living room with her phone in hand, her voice steady, confident, no longer testing the space but claiming it fully, discussing details as if they were already in motion, mentioning short-term rentals during peak seasons, calculating potential earnings with a precision that revealed how long she had been thinking about this, how thoroughly she had already mapped it out in her mind. And Daniel sat on the edge of the couch, leaning forward slightly, listening more than contributing, his silence now a form of agreement rather than hesitation. And I remained near the window, watching the reflection of both of them in the glass rather than turning to face them directly, because sometimes reflection shows you more clearly than reality. And Ashley's tone shifted as she spoke, becoming more direct, more certain, as if she no longer felt the need to soften her intentions, explaining that a property like this should not just sit unused, that it could be optimized, leveraged, turned into something far more valuable than just a quiet retreat. And she said it with a small smile, as if she were offering improvement rather than taking control, and Daniel nodded again, adding that it would be practical, that it made sense, his words echoing hers almost exactly. And I listened to them both without interruption, allowing the full shape of their plan to reveal itself completely, because once something is spoken out loud, it becomes much harder to deny later. And Ashley finally turned toward me, her expression open, almost expectant, as if waiting for acknowledgement, for validation, for the simple agreement she believed had already been given. And I met her gaze calmly, holding it for just a moment before giving the smallest nod, not of approval but of understanding, because I understood perfectly now, not just what she wanted, but how certain she was that nothing stood in her way, and that certainty was the very thing that made what would come next unavoidable. And she smiled again, satisfied, turning back to Daniel as if the conversation had been settled, already moving forward to the next detail, the next step, the next assumption. And I stepped away from the window then, my movements unhurried, crossing the room with quiet purpose, not toward them, but toward the hallway, toward the one place she had not yet entered, not because she respected it, but because she had not yet realized it mattered. And as I reached the door, I paused briefly, my hand resting lightly against the surface, feeling the stillness behind it, the weight of everything I had placed there long before this moment ever arrived. And without looking back, I turned the handle slowly, knowing that the sound alone would be enough to shift the room behind me, enough to draw their attention, enough to begin the moment they had never prepared for. The door opened without resistance, slow and deliberate, revealing a room that stood in complete contrast to everything Ashley had imagined this house to be. And for a moment, no one spoke, because the space itself did not invite interruption, it demanded attention. The walls lined with neatly arranged documents in secure glass frames, not decorative but deliberate, each one placed with precision, each one carrying weight that could not be dismissed with a casual remark or a confident assumption. And Ashley stepped forward first, her pace quick at the start, then slowing as her eyes began to take in the details she had not expected to see: legal documents, notarized copies, structured agreements, names and dates that formed a pattern too organized to be accidental. And her expression shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, controlled movements, the kind that reveal uncertainty before the mind fully processes it. And Daniel followed behind her, his posture more rigid now, his gaze moving from one document to another as if searching for something familiar, something that would align with what he believed to be true. But there was nothing here that matched his expectations, nothing that confirmed the quiet assumptions he had carried into this house. And I remained at the doorway, not entering immediately, allowing them the space to absorb what they were seeing without guidance, without explanation. Because understanding comes more clearly when it is discovered, not delivered. And Ashley reached out slightly, not touching anything, but close enough to read the details more clearly, her voice lower now, stripped of the earlier certainty, asking a question she did not finish, because the answer was already forming in front of her. And I stepped into the room then, my movements calm, measured, crossing the space with the same quiet control I had carried from the beginning. And I stopped beside the central table where a single folder rested, closed, untouched until now. And I placed my hand on it lightly, not as a claim, but as a confirmation. And when I looked at them, I saw it clearly, not confusion, not even disbelief, but the first real crack in certainty, the moment when what they thought they understood no longer aligned with what was in front of them. And I let the silence hold for just a second longer before speaking, my voice even, steady, carrying no edge, no anger, only clarity, because clarity does not need volume to be heard. And in that moment, everything they had planned, everything they had assumed, everything they believed was already theirs began to shift, not suddenly, not violently, but with the quiet, undeniable weight of something that had been decided long before they ever walked through the front door. For a few seconds, neither of them moved, as if the room itself had shifted the ground beneath them without warning. And Ashley was the first to react, though not with the confidence she had carried all afternoon, her posture tightening slightly, her eyes moving faster now, scanning the documents again as if looking for a detail she could reinterpret, something she could challenge, something that would restore the version of reality she had already accepted as fact. And Daniel stood beside her, quieter than ever, his gaze fixed on a single framed page longer than necessary, reading and rereading as if the words might change if he gave them enough time. And I did not rush the moment. I let it settle fully, because there is a difference between hearing something and understanding it. And I wanted them to reach that understanding on their own before I said anything more. And when I finally spoke, my voice was steady, calm, carrying none of the tension that had filled the house earlier. Because tension no longer belonged to me. It had shifted entirely to them. And I explained simply, without embellishment, that the villa had never been placed under Daniel's name, not even temporarily, that it was held in a private legal trust established months before the purchase was finalized, structured carefully, intentionally, in a way that made ownership clear and unchangeable. And I could see the words land, not dramatically, but with a quiet finality that left little room for interpretation. And Ashley turned toward me then, her expression composed but strained at the edges, asking a question about access, about authority, about what that meant for decisions regarding the property. And I met her gaze without hesitation, answering just as calmly, explaining that the trust outlined every condition, every limitation, every boundary, and that no changes could be made without my direct authorization, not renovations, not rentals, not sales, nothing. And Daniel finally looked at me then, really looked at me, as if seeing something he had overlooked for far too long, something he had mistaken for passivity when it had always been something else entirely. And I did not press him, I did not ask for acknowledgement, because this was not a moment that required agreement, only recognition. And Ashley took a small step back, her confidence no longer leading her movements, her thoughts now catching up to the reality in front of her. And the silence that followed was no longer comfortable, no longer controlled by her. It belonged to the truth that had been placed clearly between us. And I rested my hand lightly on the folder once more before closing it with a soft, deliberate motion, the sound quiet but definitive. And in that moment, everything they had built their expectations on began to collapse without noise. without confrontation, simply because it had never been real to begin with. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted slowly, unevenly, like something fragile being handled too late, and Ashley was the first to step away from the wall of documents. Her movements no longer sharp or certain, but measured, controlled, as if she were carefully choosing each step now instead of claiming space without thought, and her eyes moved toward Daniel, searching for something that had always been there before: agreement, reassurance, direction. But this time he did not respond the same way. He remained where he stood, his posture straighter than before, his expression no longer distant but focused in a way I had not seen in years. And for a moment, the dynamic between them shifted without a single word being spoken, and I watched it happen without interruption. Because some realizations cannot be forced, they have to unfold on their own. And Ashley finally spoke, her voice quieter now, asking what this meant for them staying here. The question simple on the surface, but carrying everything underneath it, and I turned toward her fully, meeting her gaze with the same calm steadiness I had maintained from the beginning, and I answered just as simply, explaining that the villa was not a shared space, not a temporary solution, not something open to interpretation, but a private residence with clear boundaries, and that those boundaries were not new. They had been in place from the moment the property was acquired, even if they had not been acknowledged until now. And Daniel exhaled slowly, a small, controlled breath that seemed to carry more weight than anything he had said all day. And he finally stepped forward, not toward Ashley, but toward me, his eyes holding mine with something that felt unfamiliar, not defiance, not apology, but awareness. And he asked quietly why I had not told him sooner, and I considered the question for a moment before answering. Because the truth was not complicated, it was simply uncomfortable. And I told him that I had been waiting to see what he believed without being told, to understand what assumptions he would make when no one guided him. And the room held that answer for a moment, letting it settle where it needed to. And Ashley looked away briefly, her expression tightening as the implications of that settled into place. And I did not press further. I did not explain more than necessary, because clarity does not require repetition, and I moved past them then, stepping out of the room with the same quiet composure I had carried throughout, leaving the door open behind me. Not as an invitation, but as a conclusion, and as I walked back into the main space of the villa, the air felt different again, not because anything had been taken back, but because everything had been understood, and that understanding had shifted the balance completely, without argument, without confrontation, just the quiet, undeniable presence of truth standing exactly where it had always been. The evening settled over the villa with a quiet that felt different from before, not empty, not waiting, but resolved, and I stood alone by the window once more, watching the last light fade behind the mountains, the sky shifting into soft shades of blue and gray, the kind of stillness that does not ask anything from you, only reminds you that it exists. And behind me, the house had grown quiet again, not with the restless energy that had filled it the day before, but with something more careful, more aware, as if every movement now carried the weight of understanding. And I could hear Daniel's footsteps faintly upstairs, slower than before, measured, no longer following but thinking, and Ashley's voice, once so certain, had softened into something restrained, no longer filling every space, no longer shaping every moment. And I did not need to see them to know what had changed, because the shift had already taken place the moment truth had been allowed to stand without resistance. And I took a slow breath, letting it settle deep, not out of relief, not out of victory, but out of something quieter, something steadier, the kind of calm that comes when there is nothing left to prove. And I thought back to the moment at the door, the words spoken so easily, so confidently, as if they carried authority simply because they were said out loud. And I realized then how often people mistake silence for permission, how quickly they fill it with their own expectations, their own assumptions, never considering that silence can also be a choice, a decision to wait, to watch, to understand before acting. And I turned away from the window slowly, my steps unhurried as I moved through the living room, past the furniture I had chosen, past the space that had been tested and remained unchanged. And I reached the front door, resting my hand lightly on the handle for just a moment, feeling the solid weight of it beneath my fingers, a quiet reminder of something simple, something clear, and I glanced once more toward the hallway, toward the room that had revealed everything without needing to raise its voice. And then I opened the door just enough to let the cool evening air slip inside, fresh, steady, unchanged, and I stood there for a moment, letting it pass through, letting it reset the space in a way nothing else could, before closing the door gently behind me. The sound soft but final, and as I turned back into the villa, I allowed myself a small, quiet thought, not spoken, not shared, but certain all the same, that some people walk into a place believing they can take it simply because no one stops them. But what they forget is that not every door is meant to be opened by them, and not every silence is an invitation. And this time, I had not needed to raise my voice, I had not needed to argue, because everything that needed to be understood had already been waiting, exactly where I left it, long before they ever arrived.